Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. I'm Crosby Kemper, the director of the library, and we're honored to have Matthew Dowd and Allan Katz here to talk about the paradoxes of American public life today, which could take us, a few years to sort out, but they'll do it in about 30 minutes and then take your questions. Matthew Dowd and Allan Katz. I think most of you will know Ambassador Katz, the American Public Square. He has created programs with the library in a number of cases, with UMKC, with Truman Library, with many others in town about the major issues of the day, trying to get a conversation, a civil conversation going about what we do about those issues, with people representing both sides or many sides, national figures who've come to Kansas City to speak with him. He was our ambassador to Portugal. He's had a distinguished career, and he is in the business today of informing and enlightening us. And he tonight will be in conversation with Matthew Dowd. And Matthew Dowd has had a fascinating career as a marketing guy, as his political career running the George W. Bush campaign in 2004, and beginning to become dissatisfied with his career in politics and with the Bush administration. In 2008, he voted for President Obama. In 2012, he voted for Mitt Romney. He's interested in an independent view in American politics. And he's interested in his book, his latest book, which they'll be talking about tonight, in the importance of the ends and means. He says something very profound in the book, in my belief, which is that we need to concentrate more on the means, because the means ultimately identify the ends. Ultimately, if the means are different from the ends are corrupted. And he says a profound thing in the book. He says success, and this is a message that should go to the White House. It should go to the leaders of the Democrats in the Senate who were crowing yesterday. You could see Senator Leahy and Senator Schumer on YouTube today. That success is not about winning. It's about being. It's about who you are. It's about what you do and not what the ultimate results in terms of winning or losing are. That we need to do what we're doing in the United States in a different way. And he says that we have to have a code. I have a little John Wayne magnet on my refrigerator that says a man has got to have a code. It doesn't actually spell it out, but Matthew spells it out in his book. And the very first word in the code that he recommends for us is the truth. And there is a big absence of truth in the United States today, both in the White House and elsewhere. And I hope tonight that we'll get a little truth from Matthew and Allan. It's what the Kansas City Public Library wishes to be about today, is bringing to you the truths of our politics and our culture. And I know we'll get a little bit of that tonight with Matthew Dowd and Allan Katz. Please welcome them.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and also a pleasure to find myself sitting next to Matt Dowd. I was able to do it last night at American Public Square. We talked a lot about his view of what's going on in the country, but what we didn't talk a lot about was this new book that he wrote, which is a fascinating book for those of you that haven't read it, called A New Way. And I think that what I'd really like you to start talking about, as in the beginning of the book, you talk about the journey that got you here. And Crosby talked a little about your background, what you've been involved in politics and basically consulting. And your book talks at the beginning about this journey. Why don't you explain how you got where you got?
Sure. Thank you, and it's great to be here. I love this town, though. A woman, as I was walking in, she gave me a gift, which was a flask to take to the ball game. So I didn't know if she was sending a signal about what she expected here tonight. It's awesome to be here. So I grew up, and I am Catholic. I'm one of 11 kids. Grew up in Detroit. I always whenever I tell people I'm one of 11, they either assume, okay, he's Catholic or he's Mormon. And then when I tell them my siblings' names, they get it pretty quickly, which is Mary, Denise, Patrick, Matthew, Michael, Dan, Paul, Katie, Kelly, Beth, John, Steve. So you pretty much get that they're all out of the gospel in some way. So I grew up Catholic. I've always been interested in faith. And then in the midst of 10 years or so ago, maybe it's been 12 now, a number of things happened in my life in the span of a few years. So one was I lost a son, I lost a daughter, and that twin sister of a daughter that I have now. And then my son went to Iraq, did 2 tours of duty in Iraq, which was obviously, you can imagine, stressful. And I basically threw away my political career. And I had a very public break with President Bush over the war and over our goal and what we ran on, which was bringing the country together and getting past the divides. And I didn't think we had done enough to accomplish that. The country ended up more divided. So I threw away that career, which I had built for almost 35 years, in that and said I need to do something else. And so after the midst of all of that, I've been going obviously through soul searching, and I woke up, this is in the first chapter of the book, I had a dream and I woke up, and the dream was that I had walked in the paths of the 5 major spiritual faiths. So Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And I said, I need to do that. So I called a travel agent and I said, is this possible? After I did some research, to go to where Buddha was born is in Nepal, and there's various stops in India. Went to Turkey, was going to go to Jerusalem and Galilee, and then go to Rome, and then I was going to end it in Assisi because St. Francis was always a hero of mine. And so she calls back and says, yeah, it's possible, but it's a total planes, trains, and automobiles kind of thing. So I booked I told her to book a non-refundable ticket to New Delhi because I didn't want to back out of it. And so on one day in 2007, I took a backpack and got out the airport by myself in New Delhi and basically proceeded to go on this trek. It was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, both physically and emotionally, and going through all of this and going to all of these spots. And it was probably one of the things I learned from more than anything. And it sort of begins the stages of the book, which is that the idea that what's dividing us is artificial and what unites us is real. Right? And the thing, especially in religion, if you take a look at those 5 faiths and many of the things they're taught, the fundamentals of those 5 faiths are basically the same, with differences on ritual and differences obviously on approaches and differences on teachings, but the things that bind us are much more in common. And so out of that, Allan, I sort of got a different perspective on things, got a different sort of view on life, how I was going to approach it, and that sort of began my process of what I thought or what I wanted to believe was a way to sort of a calling, a mission, to sort of how I wanted to convey the world, that this broken system, what can we do to sort of fix it, and what kind of leaders do we need? But it came out of that journey that I went on and specific things that happened on that journey.
So some would say that having been in a unique position with the current President of the United States at the time and breaking publicly with him as you did, that was not necessarily a decision of the head, but perhaps more one of the heart. And you talk in your book about this contradiction or this conflict between the head and the heart. Talk a little more about that.
Sure. So this is one of I mentioned in the book, I pick out 8 paradoxes, and the whole point of it, the idea is that we're forced into these false choices that were automatically made. You have to be this way or you have to be this way. You have to do it this way or you have to do it this way, when really life and leading is in the paradox of those 2 choices that you have that both have truth in them, that both have value in them, but is how do you bridge those things? And so part of one of the ones I talk about is that the idea everybody always talks about, like either lead with your head or use your head because you'll get into trouble if you do that. One person says that. Or the other people say you need to follow your heart, which people are like, yeah, I would follow my heart, but how does that work or what do I do? And the break that Allan's talking about, which I just mentioned, was one that actually was a process of heartfelt concern done, I think, in a way that I thought was heady. And so it's the path to that decision to break with the president publicly is a path that we often see in how we get to the truth, right? Most people get to the truth not by Paul on the road to Damascus, where the lightning hits the sky and we fall off our horse and we now know what the truth is. It's in windows. And we have to move through those windows, small windows, and step by step as we move those windows, there's small steps. And that with Bush there was a series of steps. I spoke out on certain things related to gay marriage that I thought that were done badly. I then said some things about how I thought we didn't bring the country together. And as that moved along, it finally was, this friend of mine, as you probably know, Jim Rutenberg from the New York Times, called me up and said, hey, we think this would be an interesting story. And I was at that point, I'd crossed through many windows in this, and he said, I want to fly to Austin and interview you about this story. And I said, great. So he came, we spent 2 hours in a Mexican restaurant in Austin, and I went through everything and all that, and he flies out of town. He calls me up the following Saturday and said, oh, by the way, you might want to turn your phone off. That's what he said. I was like, what? Why would I turn my phone off? Well, it seems that the Times thinks this is a big story since you're the first one of the insiders to break, and it's going to be on the front page of the New York Times. I was like, why is it on the front page of the New York Times? And it turns out it's on the front page of the New York Times Sunday above the fold, which, as anybody knows, is wow, that's the first thing everybody's going to see. So I decided in that instance, I then employed my head in that instance, which was, I thought, I don't want to do any more, right? I want to say my piece. I want to say it in a way that I thought was kind and compassionate. I didn't go after Bush personally. I stated what I thought, stated where I thought the disappointments were, stated why I was conveying it publicly, why I was doing it publicly, but I didn't want to go on, like, I'm going to write a book and say, how Bush was awful, or I didn't want to go on a series of Oprah and go on Larry King and do all these interviews. I said, I'm going to do this, and that's all I'm going to do. And that was the heart decision led me there. The head decisions sort of gave me some strategy in how it unfolded in the aftermath.
Okay, so and you also talk about how often in life the means justify the end, or the end justifies the means. I'm sorry, and so therefore we sort of excuse all kinds of things. You referred, for example, to the whole gay marriage issue, which of course was something that was used to reelect Bush in certain key states in terms of different referenda. But at the same time, there is this notion, and I'd like to get your reaction to it, because you talk about it in the book, maybe not just with this phrase, which is that morality binds us and it blinds us. That's sort of a phrase that Jonathan Haidt used. But essentially the notion being that we're with our tribe, and we somehow feel we can't leave our tribe, and therefore we can't see anything else. How big a problem is that?
So I think that's one of the biggest problems facing the country today. And it is that we've now become a more tribalized culture. And there's a guy, some of you may have read, Francis Fukuyama. He's written a lot on the history. And he wrote this book years ago. And Francis Fukuyama, it was long before we're in this time today. And he basically wrote about why do democracies emerge and work in some places and they don't work in others around the world? Why does that happen? Why do democracies are successful in other places not? And this key thing he said is that they don't work in places where people are in their tribe and they're unwilling to come together with consensus in the common good. A democracy can't work if you're unwilling to come out of your tribe and leave something behind, give something up, and work in the common good. To me, where we are at today is that because somebody puts on a red jersey, somebody puts on a blue jersey, they're unwilling to bridge any sort of empathy. They're unwilling to see the other side, and I know this is a huge part of why you're doing what you're doing, which is fabulous, is that we're continually getting into this point where the sides not only will not come to the common good, they won't even agree upon a common set of facts. And as we become more and more tribalized, my belief is we become more and more a broken democracy. And as we become a broken democracy, we can't solve the fundamental problems that exist in our country today. And we have to solve that problem.
You talk about the idea of the importance of finding our individual brand. Mm-hmm. And I'd never heard the term used the way you use it in the book, and the values that define who we are. Talk a little about that too.
Sure. So, everybody here, I'm sure, hears about the brand and what is Coca-Cola, and they all have brands and all of that, and it's become a thing in business books and all that. But each of us has a brand, right? And each of us has a brand in that who are we and what do we stand for. Oftentimes, people confuse their resume and their bios for their brand. And I mentioned it's a book. Your brand isn't your bio, right? Your brand isn't that you're married, you work at an insurance company, you have 3 kids and all that, all important parts of you. Your brand is what do you want to present yourself to the world and the values you represent. And every single person or institution or whatever your foundation needs to understand that they have something that their mission, their value, whatever it is they're doing, they want to present. Are you a person that's tolerant? Are you a person that wants to be seen as compassionate? Are you a person that wants to be seen as strong and decisive? All of those things are a brand. And I think it's important for all of us to understand when we walk out, when we walk in here, when we talk to people, we are conveying a set of values that is part of who we are. It's not just like, well, let me just tell you something about me, and here's 3 things that are all part of your biography. It is understanding that whatever set of values we have and how we live those set of values becomes our brand.
Yeah, and to take that a little further, you also talk about the fact that we have a tendency to be uncomfortable with a complicated idea, and we had a program with former Senator Jack Danforth about 2 years ago, and one of the things he said, and I'd like you to comment on this, was that for a politician, they can give a 2-minute answer to any question. Doesn't really matter. If you really want to know what people, if they're any good, make them talk about one topic for 30 minutes. Does that sort of fit into what you're talking about in your book?
Yeah, I think that. I think one of the problems in our public discourse today, our political discourse, is that we want these instant, quick, microwave answers that are all been programmed and all that, and they're not going to offend anybody, and they're not going to do anything that it is not going to cause somebody to think. What we want to do, what happens in politics, is that you search for cues to give to people. It's quick cues to give to somebody so they sort of give them a direction of where to go. And we are in a time that we have crisis overload, we have information overload, and we are in our inherent nature cognitive misers, right? And even crisis misers, which is we can only deal with so much in so time. And therefore, leaders that sort of can give us a shortcut, it's easier for us. But I think part of the process, one of the things I don't know if people know is we've become now that everybody has to have the instant answer quick, and here's the little card, and here's read it. But you think about the way it used to be. Abraham Lincoln Abraham Lincoln didn't arrive in a forum with the perfect speech that he gave, right? Abraham Lincoln would spend days and days and days giving a different version of the speech and getting response from the audience about what was mattered to them, what worked. And by the end of that process, he basically had the speech that he wanted to convey in a way that connected with people and was thoughtful and mindful and all of that. If a politician did that today, they would be like, that person, you can't trust that person. Look, he said this in Toledo, and he said this in Cleveland, and can you believe he did this, and he changed the thing and all of that. We don't allow space for contemplation and thoughtfulness and people to evolve and grow. But one of the things about evolving and growing is we can let people change, but we want an explanation for the change, right? And this is one of the things that I disagree on what's gone on with Donald Trump. And people have said to me, well, isn't it great that he's changed? Yeah, it's great that people change, but I want to know that they learned, right? And there's a difference between those two things. I want to know somebody changed and learned, and I want to know why. I want to know, great, he moved from this position to this position. What are the facts that he learned? What are his fundamental principles or her fundamental principles? And why did they change, and what journey were they on? Got it. I got the picture. Got it. That's great. Unless we know that, then I have no idea what was the thought process and what were the values involved in changing.
But as you know, and you talk in your book again about the impact of technology, sort of what it's done, it's kind of like, we all walk around with our phones and we're getting 40 messages every 5 minutes of all kinds of different pieces of information, and we don't stop. And how within the process, you worked in the political process, you understand how campaigns are constructed. How do we sort of change this whole paradigm that we have now, which basically is sort of this poll-tested, money-infused form of whatever it is that we've got?
Okay. So this is you're going to be the Pollyanna Matthew, right? At this point, so which I actually believe is the only way this changes, right? We have to change. Me, and each of us have to change in order for our leaders to change, because leaders don't lead, they follow. Leaders don't fundamentally lead, they follow. And the best leaders in our country figure out where the country, the aspirational quality of the country, and where the country fundamentally wants to go and how the country wants to behave, and gets a half a step in front of where the country already wants to go, where the community wants to go. And so I think we have to give direction to our leaders in how we behave and how we relate to each other and how we gather information. The problem with technology, like all history of technology, is that with every technological change and advancement, there's gain and there's loss, right? And we see the gain, but we've also lost. So we have more connections today, but we're less in touch with people. It's raining data, but we're thirsty for wisdom. Right? We have all of this stuff, and I think we have to give space. I think too many of us we don't give the space to our leaders to move in the way they need to move, to give them a path of compassion and a place for it, because we want a quick response, to know where they're with us. And so until we teach our leaders, now we can have an expectation that we want leaders, that we want them to be humble servants, that we want them to serve the public. We want them, all of that's right, and we should find and search for those leaders that reflect that. But I don't think they're going to change until we do, because I think politics is a marketplace, right? And the marketplace responds to consumers. And we, as the consumers, have to change our habits in order for the political marketplace to respond to new consumer habits.
No, I think you're right. I think that essentially there's the old saying, we get the leaders we deserve. But I think to some degree the idea of demanding more of people, not particularly on, they have to agree with me on this, but they have to behave differently. And within that context, you made a comment last night which I think would be worth exploring, which is that with President Trump, in terms of what you think, not what his policies are, but his having won this election and him being president now portends for the future in terms of change.
Sure. So I think there was, Allan and I talked about this last night, is both political parties, leaders of both parties have learned the wrong lessons from this last election. They both sides have learned the wrong lessons from this last election. Republicans have learned the wrong lesson in that they think that Donald Trump won the election with his tone and his manner and his way and all of that, and therefore that's what we need to do with the American public, right? Donald Trump won in spite of himself, not because of himself, right? Donald Trump ended Election Day with 60 or 62% of the American public, an unfavorable opinion of him, of the American public had of him. One of every 4 Donald Trump voters, think about this, 25% of Donald Trump's vote voted for him, believing he was not qualified to be president and he didn't have the temperament to be president. 25% of his voters. That's 16 million people voted for him knowing that. Why? And they voted for him knowing that because of what they didn't like on the other side of this. And so the Democrats, I think, have not learned from this election, which is the Democrats are always like, well, demography, the country is changing, and therefore we're going to win elections, and the way the country is changing is going to be to our benefit, and therefore that's all, that's what we need to do. It's just going to naturally happen. Well, the Democrats have to figure out a way to present to groups that aren't reflected in their coalition that exists today, to present to voters in places and in times, because right now, though demography is a benefit to Democrats, geography is a benefit to Republicans. Look at the map of the United States and the way the map looks. And most political jurisdictions are defined by geography. And so I think what's happened, which always happens, is a lot of the wrong lessons are learned. And I think even losses. I learned more from my losses in life, as you, I'm sure, have,
exactly,
both political and personal. Then I remember when I learned early on, when I lost a political campaign, not to sort of say, oh, if just this happened, I would have won. I learned, like, what did we do wrong? What our campaign should have done better? Because blaming it on somebody else and blaming it on something else means you're never going to actually correct the behavior that needs to be corrected. And I think both sides need to correct behavior that needs to be corrected, but they both are learning the wrong lessons.
You also talk about it's important to have a sense of humor, for leaders to have a sense of humor. I think what makes it hard now is the polarization is so intense that when someone is sort of, I remember George Bush making certain jokes and Democrats being just outraged that he would joke about something, that it was this, quote, serious thing. And the same thing with Republicans and Obama. It struck me that we had sort of have collectively lost our capacity to sort of put down our partisan hats and just find something that's funny to be funny.
So this is towards the end of the book, which I actually think fun and discovering where the fun is and where the enjoyment is and where the joy is in anything that we do has become an important part of life. But it usually defines who's going to win. And I say this because there was an interesting thing happen. I'm a big believer in the Southwest Airlines theory, which is they seem to be having a lot of fun. I want to fly on that airplane, right? The same is true in political campaigns and in candidates that convey a sense of they're enjoying this and a sense of humor and a sense. So some journalists came to our campaign in 2004 and they said, we want to go through the polls and who's going to win. And so I did all of that, right? And it's like, here's why and here's this, be a close election, but I think, we're going to win. Bush will beat Kerry, blah, blah, blah. But I said, just ignore all that because you're going to go over to Kerry's campaign and they're going to tell you the same exact thing. They're going to go through all the polls and say blah, 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 blah. I said, just do this. And I'm not going to give you the answer. Walk through our campaign and walk through their campaign. And whoever's having the most fun and whoever's enjoying it, that person's going to win. And they did that. 2 weeks later, came back to me and said, your guys are going to win. And I think that's true in life. I think that is, I tell a story, and I tell a story about having fun. I grew up, as I said, I told you, I grew up in Detroit, one of 11. We didn't have a lot, and we tried to create fun games. And this was a sort of an aside story. I don't advocate this for anybody with children. I don't know about that. So we didn't have much, so what we would learn to do is play with fire, right? Because fire seemed exciting. And we did a game where we'd get my mom's dish rags and we'd tie them in a big ball of knots together from under the sink, and then we'd soak it in gasoline, the big ball of knots, overnight. This was a thing you had to plan. You'd soak it in gasoline overnight, and then you'd take it out on Saturday morning or whatever, and you'd light the ball of knotted gasoline with a match, and you'd skid around in a circle, and you'd kick the ball of knotted fire at each other. This was the game. And if the ball hit you and the flame stayed on you, then you were out that round. This was our fun. And so as I said in the book, I said, you don't need, and we called it, this is the funniest part of this, so we called this game Bumblebee Bee. It was the name of the game, because every game has to have a name. And the reason why it was Bumblebee Bee was when the lit ball of rags flew by your ear, it sounded like a bumblebee. So that's part of the fun that we had. And you wonder why I wanted to get into politics.
I was going to say that the next logical step was getting involved in politics. After that, it was good training for it, right? So we're going to get to questions here in a second. And I think there's some microphones set up, I've been told. But before we do that, while that's being done, let me sort of ask you. You talk about in the book, which I thought was one of the more interesting things, was you talk about exercising the soul like you exercise other parts of your body. How would you define your soul, and what are some tangible ways for those that maybe don't necessarily identify as spiritual or religious to engage in these exercises?
Sure. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm Catholic, a person of faith, but I actually define a people of faith in a broad way. It doesn't necessarily mean a religious way. I think a person of faith and a person of soul can be a person that connects to the mountains, and they get a sense of bigger things in life. They're only part of a bigger picture, or somebody that can connect to a community of people that binds them together and gives them something outside of themselves that's bigger than themselves, that gives them a centered place. And so the thing I talked about for all of us, I believe, is we all talk about like we need to exercise our body and our health and all that needs to be kept in mind, and we go through regular exercise and we say we need to eat right and we say we need to do this and we have a regular program. I actually think we need to do the same thing for our souls as we define them as our center and our way that connects with the broader humanity and gives us something bigger than himself. And I think it's important. Every major religion has taught this in some way. There's a practice that you have, whether it's the call to prayer in the Muslim faith, whether it's Catholics, what you do in Catholicism, what you do in Judaism, whatever, Hinduism, whatever, there's always some practice. And I emphasize in here that one of the things, I think we have a poverty of soul in this country. I think that it's not only a poverty of actual poverty, which is awful, but we also have people that are wealthy, people that live at all means, that feel like there's no meaning in life, that feel like I don't feel like anything is important, or whatever it happens to be. And a way to do that is establishing a practice that puts you in a contemplative place that allows you to find that center within you and allows you to sort of broaden your horizon so that you realize you're part of a much broader thing. But it takes a practice. I have a practice I do every single day, all the time, because I know the world is such a play that with all this going on, you have to have something to return to that centers you, that allows you to go out with value.
I have one more question, then we are going to get to the questions. We talked a little about it last night. I think, again, it's sort of an underpinning of your book and what you're talking about, and that is this notion that somehow we have formed most of our opinions, our values, are emotional and intuitive, and yet we somehow think that through logic we can change someone else.
Yeah.
Talk a little about that.
So, yeah, I said last night is you can't break an emotional connection with a rational argument. Think about that. Let me say that again. You cannot break an emotional connection with a rational argument. And so everybody in this room who thinks, I don't understand why I can't convince a Trump voter why he's not good for the country or whatever it is, they have an emotional connection. Just like most people create emotional connection. In a relationship, you've had sons or daughters or brothers or sisters that has something that was like, that person's not good for you. Well, you're not going to be able to rationally tell them a series of things, and the only way you can break an emotional connection, if we need to establish, is with another emotional connection that allows you to get to people's head. So you have to establish an emotional connection with some gut level, some heart level, before you can get to a rational conversation or a rational argument, before you can present people the facts, before you can present people with logic. And one of the things that I think we're in desperate need in this country is a bridging of the empathy gap. That we lack empathy for people that are opposite from us, that don't look like us, that don't believe like us. And they also don't have empathy for us where we are. And this election was it showed completely that this huge empathy gap. The people on each side had no understanding of why the other side might be afraid, might be frustrated, might be angry, for whatever reason they happen to be angry. And so until we establish a connection that is either from a shared joy or a shared sorrow, that's usually where empathy comes in. We share a joy or we share a sorrow. Somebody got a divorce, somebody lost a child, somebody has a disabled child in their family, somebody went through drug addiction, somebody went through alcohol addiction, whatever all of those things, somebody fell in love in a great, fascinating way. We have to figure out a way to figure out what are our shared sorrows of people of opposite political opinions of us, and then once we figure out a shared sorrow or a shared joy, then we can have a political conversation.
Okay, so I see we have someone here ready to ask a question. The only thing I would encourage members of the audience to come and get in line if you want to ask a question. I would just sort of underscore one thing. What we really are hoping for are questions as opposed to speeches. So, with that.
Well, and before you say that, I'll give a thing on that thing. So, no Chris Matthews questions. Okay? And I say that because here's why. Chris Matthews, I went on Chris Matthews' show about 7 or 8 years ago to do something, and Chris Matthews did his standard long thing, right? And then he goes, so, right? After this long thing. And I said to Chris Matthews, I said, just because you stream together 500 words and put a question mark at the end doesn't make it a question. So we're trying for questions.
With that challenge, so go ahead.
Have you heard the following from people in the last few years? That they have become so disgusted with the whole political process and the electoral process and both of the major parties that there's been a fundamental shift in feeling towards government, and that dividing history into before this latest election and after, that things are going to be really different, and the two major political parties are going to be unable to respond in a constructive and progressive method to that.
So, bingo. So I think the two major political parties, and this has been coming for a while, and this election, all aspects of the election demonstrated it, I think, clearly, is the two political parties that exist today are dinosaurs. And the asteroids already hit the planet. And they're over there munching in a field, and they think everything's still fine, and the cloud's coming for them. And unless they change or reform fundamentally way, because they institutionally do not meet the majority where the majority of the country are. Neither major political party today. Neither major political party looks like the country. Neither one looks like the country. In all of the attributes of what the country is, neither one looks like the country. That has to change. It is a system that has been, that the reason why voters keep saying they vote for Obama and then they vote for Republicans in the Congress, they vote for Bush, they keep trying in the system to figure out what they want, but they keep saying it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. And I think we're at a time, and Bernie, I'll give you a thing. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump showed this, right? Both are basically, one's an independent senator from Vermont, a 74-year-old independent senator from Vermont, that almost beat somebody that he was 50 points behind, and he had no money and no endorsements. He won 22 primaries and caucus. He was basically taking on the system, and he was showing the system doesn't work as it does. Donald Trump changed parties 7 times in 14 years. Right? Donald Trump wasn't a Republican. Donald Trump did a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And Donald Trump sort of showed that he didn't have to go through all the things and the gatekeeper quality of the party and all of that. And so this duopoly, I like to call it this duopoly of these two parties, both rated today at their lowest rating simultaneously. The two major political parties are rated negatively by a majority of the country, both major political parties. So you're right. There's something coming, there's something brewing, and either they're going to reform themselves or something new. Independents are going to run outside of it for local office. They'll run here in Kansas City, they'll run in Overland Park, they'll run in Topeka, they'll run in all kinds of places because they're basically saying the system is broken and it no longer works. And this election should have put an exclamation point on it for people, but you know, monopolies or duopolies, you have to pull hold from them. They don't give it up reasonably. You have to pull it away from them, and I think the country is going to begin to pull it away from them.
Yes, sir.
You said that politics is a marketplace. When I was growing up, a brand was a firm that was exceptionally trusted. So I'm a little uneasy with this notion, and it didn't start with your comment today, that everybody has a brand. I think you earn a brand. But what I'm really interested in hearing more about, and I haven't really heard anything, is the fact that money outside the formal political system, in fact, has driven us into a marketplace situation where all this activity within the traditional systems doesn't seem to count. So where does Citizens United fit in? Where does Swift boating in 2014 or 2004 fit in? They weren't very happy for a reason.
Sure. So first, I'll agree with your first point, which is brands are earned, and they're not just, which is why they're important values, and you have to earn a value. And brands are demonstrated by actions, thoughts, actions, and words being in alignment, as Gandhi used to say. The second thing is, yes, money matters, but I'm totally disagree with the idea that money is causing the problem. Money is a factor in it, but money matters less today than it's ever mattered. Money, the facts are, money matters less today than it ever mattered. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump in almost every major state that she lost. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump in almost every major state when you add up all the money in the states. Mitt Romney, in many of the states he lost, outspent Barack Obama in many of the places he lost. And so money, yes, matters, but money mattered more 10 years ago or 5 years ago than it does today, because the way money is spent today, which is on advertising, people pay less and less attention to ads. They don't believe them. They don't trust them. And so, yes, money needs big money. It'd be better if it was out of politics, but the solution to this is an institutional reform, political institutional reform, because, as Allan knows very well, when you have a system where based on a system where you run campaigns with a First Amendment and all that, money is going to be in the system, but the money in the system right now is not the fundamental flaw in the system. The fundamental flaw in the system is that we have a political party system that is not being responsive to the American public because it's only a bifurcated choice that people have.
And let me just sort of add a point to that on the money thing. I think the key is this. Certainly in presidential campaigns and hotly contested statewide campaigns, the money's relatively equal. The money kind of like plays off itself. I think I would argue that if you had a local race where a challenger is outspent 10 or 15 to 1, then money may well determine the outcome. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate your comments about humor, and I think that really is important. I've come to appreciate the humor that we hear from George W. Bush. I really have enjoyed his humor. I'm a Democrat. I voted for Obama. I did not like Bush. My question to you is, you've spoken about, have you spoken to the President Bush recently? He seems to have been on the same journey that you've been on. We were just at the library in Texas. We love presidents and presidential history, and he seems tortured somehow. We saw the paintings that he's done of the Iraqi soldiers and the veterans, and they are really touching. And so I'm just wondering, have you talked to him?
So the short answer is no, I have not. I've actually reflected on that, watching that, and I'm unaware of it, watching his whole, the way he's adapted to painting and the way it looks like, and I'm not going to... George W. Bush, like his father, comes from an era and a family that's like, psychobabble, why are we talking about all that? They're sort of view that all like, don't examine that, just move on. There's sort of that sort of thing, just ignore that, get going. That's their mode, but you have to look from afar, the process he's going through, and how he's doing that with everything he's doing, and obviously decisions he made while in office and the result of those decisions. It certainly looks like to me, and I have not talked to him, it certainly looks like to me that he's been on a journey since he's left office. But I'm also amazed at how I remember I used to, after the election, how much Democrats would be like, God, I cannot believe you worked for that awful person. How horrible that must be. And now they're like, wow, George W. Bush, he's kind of a, can we get him back here?
It's our conversation anyway. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. Kansas City, we're all here tonight because we have opinions of Washington, D.C. What's Washington, D.C.'s opinion and outlook of what Kansas City is?
What's Washington, D.C.'s opinion of Kansas City?
Yeah.
What do you mean? Tell me what...
Well, in politics, they look at geography. You mentioned that earlier. What do politicians in Washington, D.C., whether they're from this part of the country or a senator from Delaware, what do they think of when they think of Kansas City?
I don't know. Well, I think some of them are like, when are the Royals going to start winning again? I think that, though I know they won last night, so their first win in 10 games, which is great. I'm a Detroit Tiger fan, so as long as you lose against the Tigers, you can win all your games. I don't care. All your other games. I think I'm going to broaden it a little bit, which is I think the people in Washington are very nervous about what's going on in the country, and they don't know what to do. Right? I think their standard playbook that they've always utilized isn't working. Like, how do I, on both sides of the aisle, how do I relate and what am I doing? And because they sense there's something going on in the country that they don't have control over, and that it's out in the country and all the places around. And so, from my sense, and maybe that's not answer your question, but I think in looking at places like Kansas City and in other places, I think there's a nervousness about like where is this going and where does the country want to go, because it doesn't look like what I've always done before is working anymore, and how I respond to this. And I actually think they're right to be nervous, because I think that the change is going to come from Kansas City, and it's going to come from the various towns around the country. That's where the change will come, and it will flood towards Washington, and that they'll then fundamentally have to respond to it. But my guess is, I think I'm a believer, and I've worked both sides of the aisle, and I've worked with people on both sides. 95% of the people that I've worked with and known are very well-intentioned people. They're very good people that get into it for the right reason. They want to do the right thing. They want to represent people, most all of the people. But our political system in Washington is like a sick building. It's like it's got lead pipes and it's got mold. And when you go into it, you're healthy, but when you stay too long, you get sick. or you leave quickly because like, I'm not going to stay in that building. And so I think that's part of what's going on is that the people out here in Kansas City know that the building, we need to do something about the building. And I think the leaders are really nervous right now in what they need to do in response to what's going on in the country.
Yeah, and I think if you take that example, I think a lot of Democratic members of Congress in 2009, when they went home and they encountered was the origins of the Tea Party over the Affordable Care Act, they were shocked that this many people in their districts, because remember, these were Democratic districts because they were Democratic members of Congress. You can look at the same thing today, Republicans going home saying, oh, do I really want to face, even though they're in Republican districts, do I really want to face this? And I think that, Matt, you're exactly right, that what's happened is that they don't know what this really means because they used to be able to control all this and now it's out of control. I think it's over here. Yes, sir.
Thanks, sir. Yeah. Here's an aphorism that came to me one day. You might be able to use it. If you are who you say you are and your actions are consistent with your beliefs, you're already in heaven, even if you live in hell. I have another.
I agree with that.
Okay. Dick Cheney won his war in Iraq. The oil companies are running Iraq and making millions and millions of dollars. Why is it okay for a 20-year-old rifleman to die for God knows what, and the oil companies not to share some of their revenue with the people who've had that loss?
So obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I've had a son who I went through this experience and actually changed, it sort of evolved my view on this. I'm going to take this a little step further, which is I think we need to re-examine at a fundamental level our steps into war, at a fundamental level, a really fundamental level. I went to the World War I Museum. I went to the World War I Museum today, right? Millions and millions and millions of young men and young women were killed in that war. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier came out of that war, which was designed because it was such a bloody, horrible war. They couldn't even find out who died, so they put us because they couldn't even remnants of them. And I think that we're at the point, my view, and maybe it's my evolution in this, and I, as a Christian and as a Catholic in this, I think that it's very difficult for me to believe that wars are actually going to fundamentally advance the cause of the globe in any real fundamental way. And the Iraq War is a perfect example. Trillions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost, injuries, people that are in hospitals, men and women that are in hospitals. It's just an awful situation. But I would like to say, yes, the Iraq War was obviously a mistake, and bad things have come out of it. All of that is true, and we need to take care of the people that were suffered through all of that. And actually, we need leaders to actually admit this process. But I would say our leaders, I think, need to fundamentally examine the nature of warfare and the nature of wars in the 21st century and really ask the question, are the steps we want to make anymore, do they serve the public interest in making those steps? I think we really need to ask that question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple things you said really reminded me of some thoughts I've had during the election. One, that we're in a bit of data overload and tragedy overload. And then this idea of, do our leaders lead us or do they follow us, and that kind of a thing. And I worry that the long-term lesson of this election when we look back will be that when our society finds itself in this place where we don't have trust in institutions, we have a hard time figuring out the truth, that what it did is made us very susceptible to a different kind of leader, which is demagoguery. And I worry about the long-term effects of demagoguery being successful in a political campaign like it was. And so I'm curious your thoughts on if you see that trend, what happens if in 2020 it's for Donald Trump's people behaving that way running for president, and that's the only way you can win.
So I think that's a valid worry. I think that's a very valid worry, because when we no longer have a common set of facts and people basically say, I'm going to turn it over to the leader and he's going to tell us what to do and I'm going to go along with whatever that is and deny whatever. We've seen this movie before in the history of the world, how these turn out, and they don't usually turn out well. The only way to solve that problem is us to push back and say, wait, facts matter. Support journalists who are the one on the front line of this. The journalists are on the front line of trying to figure out a way to answer this on both sides. And I'm not saying this is a conservative problem or a liberal or a progressive problem. On both sides, we need this, and we need to engage more. We need to actually step up And I think I'm optimistic on this because I'm optimistic in that there's a greater energy today of wanting to be involved and understanding what's at stake. I think we took a lot of things for granted for many years, thinking it could never go away and would never, and I think people now are thinking, wait a second, if I don't get involved, if I don't engage, if I don't go to meetings, if I don't vote, if I don't have conversations like Allan is having with his group, I'm basically walking away from this and leaving it to somebody else. So I think it is a worry, but I actually think we have the power to change that.
Yes, sir.
Hi. Beautiful segue into the question I was going to ask you, which an earlier questioner mentioned the problem of money in politics, and I perceive there to be a problem of technology and micro-targeting and behavioral modeling that has created information silos that good people that are neighbors are living inside different information silos, and that explains to some extent the polarization. Could you comment on whether you have what your thoughts are on that topic?
So I think that's a development that I actually think has been worse for our politics than money has, which is there's a natural human tendency. Sociologists call it confirmation bias, right? And what that means is we seek out information that confirms our biases because it makes us feel good, and we ignore information or run away from information that makes us feel uncomfortable. And we have an easy way to do that now. So people on one side can watch Fox News and listen to radio shows, and people on the other side can watch MSNBC and listen to radio shows, and they can all access their own blogs and access their own websites and do all that, and it confirms their biases, and they get more solidified in that bias, and they're unwilling to come across because they have a whole completely different view and value set. So that's absolutely true. And the other thing that's added to that is America is sorting itself out more homogeneously, and I think this is a problem. We are becoming more grouped together in communities, I mean actually where we live, go to school, church, community centers, of people that are like us, that look like us, act like us, and think like us. We're associating now because we're actually, and that's a natural thing because when you're in a place of fear and you're in a place of like, I don't know what's going on, I need to be around my own, I need to be more associated. That's a detrimental aspect of our society that's happening. And as I say, I'm just going to keep saying this, we have to figure out how to wait. If we're a progressive, we need to expose ourselves to information that is being conveyed on another aspect so we can actually understand, think it through. We need to actually walk in somebody else's shoes. We need to go to communities. We need to sort of delve into those. And we shouldn't wait on others. We can't think, well, I'm going to wait on them to do it because they're messed up, right? It's those people over there that are messed up. We're good over here. They should come over here. And we have to get up if we want to change this. And it's a problem of the communication technology that we're in that we're able to do this. I mean, the average person today has 220 channels into their house. The average person today has 220. So they can flip around until they get what they want, and they have obviously a computer that access it. But we're going to have to figure out, we have to go to stuff that makes us uncomfortable. We have to go and find information and go find people that make us uncomfortable.
All right, and to take that one step further, Bill Bishop wrote a book called The Big Short.
Yes.
And
he's a friend of me. He lives outside of Austin.
And he points out that in 1976, about 25% of Americans lived in counties that were so-called landslide counties that went for one party or the other by over 20%. By 2004, over half of Americans lived in landslide counties. One of the reasons we're able to do it is because we've become economically mobile. So we can actually find those places where I'd rather live. I went down the street, I saw a bunch of Trump signs, I'm not going to buy a house on that street. I saw a bunch of Obama signs, I'm not going to buy a house on that street. And that really has sort of helped, exacerbate the situation. But Matt's right, I mean, you really have to we have to step out. And if it doesn't happen here in the Kansas Cities of the world, it's just not going to happen. Okay, we got time for the two more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Two-part connected question. To what? I'll be short though.
This sounds like Sean Spicer press thing. I don't think the crowds were that big. And I know the Civil War was in 1861.
And Frederick Douglass isn't alive, right? Okay, that's good.
I know that too, but
go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
hear that. To what degree does a politician's professional background contribute to the gridlock in politics, i.e., lawyers are taught to win on behalf of their clients and do whatever it takes? And then B is, if there was more diversity in politics of all sorts, including professionals with a management or economics or psychology or business or science backgrounds, would there be a different outlook and outcome when it comes to how the people's business is done? Meaning, people who are representing us either in Washington, D.C. or state capitals and stuff, so often they're from legal backgrounds or just a small, scattering. But if we had more diversity in what type of person we send to represent us, would it make a difference?
Yes, it would absolutely make a difference, and I think everybody in this room should figure out, we all have to figure out our voices and what we want to do to change the system, whether we want to run, whether we want to help people to run. I absolutely agree. We have become a professionalized system. I want people that have experience and knowledge and all of that, but I actually think we would majorly benefit if we had people that were nurses that ran for office, if we had people that served in a community in some way that ran for office and served in office. Because I think one of the things that we need, so I talk about it in the book, is we have to go back to a humble servant leader model. That you're serving because you want to serve in the common good, you serve for a time, and then you go back home to whatever it was you were doing before. You serve for a time, do the job that you're supposed to do in interest of the common good. But I absolutely agree that when we look at legislative bodies, when we look at different things, they are surrounded they're very demographically and heterogeneously and professionally similar. So I absolutely agree. The more diverse we could make it, the better.
I see solutions that Congress doesn't see, and it frustrates me. And I know it's because I have a different, diverse background.
And the interesting thing about this, I went to a long seminar about how diversity and inclusion, you have to have both. You can't just have diversity, you have to have inclusion. So if somebody says, well, we added women to this, but we're not going to invite them to the meetings or whatever, they look at our workplace, it's so diverse. Well, those people aren't really at the meeting. So there was a study done that said that the companies that were most innovative and are most successful are the companies that are most diverse and most inclusive. And our politics ought to be the same thing.
Yes, that's
And the one thing I would even add to that is that until about 40 to 50 years ago in Washington, members could come with an administration, they would serve, and then they'd go home. A member of Congress, they would serve, and then they would go home. Now they all stay, and they become heads of lobbyists, or they become heads of think tanks, or whatever it is. And so what you had is this growing amount of, there's a lot of historical knowledge, but the problem is there is this one way of looking at things. And that's what you said. They go into the building and they get the mold and they get the lead.
Okay, so what about term limits? You brought.
Well,
you guys
I don't want to
really,
I don't want to walk down that road, but
okay,
I think
I
the
won't
term.
force you,
I wish it. I lived in a state in Florida where they had term limits in the legislature, and the legislature got worse and worse and worse. I don't know whether it's because of term limits, but term limits didn't solve the problem. It just had created a whole bunch of people who basically that was the best job they could ever have in their life, and I'm not sure that was such a good thing.
I think our founding fathers and our founding mothers were right, and they established term limits, and it's up to us to enforce the term limits, which is an election.
Is to acknowledge.
We have term limits, and it's an election.
I believe in mentoring,
Yeah.
knowing when to step aside and
But
pass
I think that we'll get to the last question in just a second. I think one of the things that and I think Matt and I agree on this. We haven't really talked about it. Is I have an enormous amount of faith in the American people. And even though they disappoint me at times, and even though at times they make me want to pull out my hair, and they make me I say, how could people reach this conclusion? I think that people essentially want to do the right thing. And only if they are basically pushed in a direction where they believe that they are threatened by doing something else, will they not do the right thing? And unfortunately, we've allowed our politics to do that, and really it's up to us to sort of to rip that back. Yes, ma'am.
Just commenting on that last answer, there is actually a nurse out of St. Louis, and she's black, and she's running for Congress.
Awesome.
So I was a delegate at last summer's DNC, where there was obviously a lot of infighting. The only unity there was the campaigns hiding the infighting for the cameras. So if we're unable to, even compromise within our tribes. How can we make the duopoly work? Do you see a rise in independents like Greg Orman or Brand New Congress, or could something like ranked choice voting fix that?
So, obviously, so the answer is yes, I think all of those things can be fixed. But I think what's going to happen, here's what I predict is going to happen. I think you're going to have more and more people like Greg Orman run at local levels, run for statewide office and local office because they're tired of the system and they think it doesn't work. And then you're going to have more and more people like Bernie Sanders and others that basically say, I'm going to run in the party, but I'm going to run as a disruptive force within the party because the party needs to change. That fundamentally, things in the party is not being responsive. And so I think you're going to see all of that. But in the end, the way these things don't work is let's go find us a new president and that's going to fix the problem, right? Like this idea, like we're going to get rid of Trump and all the problems will be fixed again, right? All of them, well, they won't be because Trump is a result of the problems. Trump, for whatever you say about Trump, Trump is an outcome of all of this frustration and everything that's going on, and people finally basically decided to go to Mexico for the experimental treatment, right? I mean, that's what they did. It was like, I might have side effects, but I've tried everything else, and I'm going to go to Mexico. And that's a result of all of this. And so I think all of those things, but I don't think the way it's going to break is when those candidates, Democrats run and break up the system, Republicans run and they break up their system, and independents come in and run. I mean, people used to say the taxi industry, there's no way to come in and break up the taxi industry. Jeff Bezos pitched to 18 different investment firms his idea of Amazon, of people being able to sit at their computer and order stuff, and he was turned down 18 times, and he's now the second wealthiest person in the world, right? The system is demanding innovation, and part of that innovation is us figuring out a way to break up the system that is today so it's responsive.
And I think the other thing, too, and we talked about this, is that ultimately, if the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are going to remain the duopoly that they are, it's going to require Democrats really being much tougher on Democrats and Republicans being much tougher on Republicans, not just in terms of being ideologically pure, because that's the test that drives us apart, but that basically sort of like your job, if I elect you, is not to necessarily for me to agree with you on everything, but you have to solve the problem. That's why you're there. And if you can't solve the problem, don't tell me about the Republicans. I'm a Democrat. I voted for Democrat. And if you're not going to do it, I'm going to vote against you and get some other person in there that can solve the problem. And I might even vote for a Republican if they can solve the problem. But until we get to that point, what I worry about is Republicans don't care if Democrats attack them today, and Democrats don't care if Republicans attack them. They expect it and they discount it. And as a result, even though the criticisms may be absolutely valid, they no longer resonate. When they start resonating again, I believe, and I don't know if you agree with me, things will change.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, man. Great job.
Yep.
Great job.
This is great. As always.